So, human-caused sources of greenhouse gas are usually the most significant because the burning of fossil fuels and agricultural products and deforestation, landfills, industrial production, those are all like new chemicals. Those are all things that humans do. Tens of hundreds of millions of years ago, organisms were sometimes buried without first decomposing into carbon dioxide. And I've outlined that process for you before. And the carbon contained within inside of these organisms, called fossil carbon, is slowly converted into a fossil fuel deep underground. And when humans bring those up to the Earth's surface and we burn them as fossil fuels, we produce carbon dioxide gas, and that goes into the atmosphere. Because of the long time required to convert this carbon into fossil fuels, the rate of putting carbon into atmosphere by burning the fossil fuels is much greater than the rate at which producers take CO2 out of the air. And both the producers and the consumers, they contribute to this pool of burning fossil fuel carbons, right? And because fossil fuels differ in how we store energy, each type of fossil fuel produces different amounts of carbon dioxide. So for any given amount of energy, burning coal produces the most CO2. You can compare that by burning oil, which produces about 85% CO2, and natural gas only produces 56% as much as CO2. As we've seen before, the perspective of carbon dioxide emissions, for all purposes, natural gas is considered to be the better fuel for the environment. But the production of fossil fuels, when we mine them of coal and the combustion of them and how they release methane and nitrous oxide still doesn't give them a very good case. In addition to that, we've also discussed that particulate matter, it can also play a role in global warming. Particulate matter, known as black soot to many people, it reflects solar radiation under some conditions, and recent findings have suggested that it may be responsible for up to a quarter of observed global warming during the past century, and that's quite a significant amount. Particulates, they fall on ice and snow, and in higher latitudes, they actually will allow for a higher absorption. They'll absorb more energy from the sun and lowering the albedo of that particular area. So as the snow and ice begin to melt, the particulates become more concentrated on the surface. And the increased concentration raises the amount of solar radiation that's absorbed, which increases melting. Just due to temperature. All right, so the positive feedback system might help explain this a little bit better for global warming, and we'll get to that in a minute. But essentially, when atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, they have not really been observed widespread in terms of like high particulate matter like soot and coal particles. Finally here, these not finally, but agriculture, the process of production of food, that produces a whole variety of greenhouse gases. Agricultural fields, they can be over-irrigated, and for people who are deliberately flood them, usually to cultivate things that aren't supposed to be there, like rice, they will do this and they'll create a low oxygen environment, kind of similar to a wetland. This rice comes to mind here when they make rice. And it can produce a lot of methane and a lot of nitrous oxide. In addition, synthetic fertilizers, manures, and crops that naturally fix atmospheric nitrogen, like alfalfa, those can also create an excess amount of nitrates in the soil, and that in turn is converted to nitrous oxide by the process of denitrification. Also, raising livestock can produce large quantities of methane. Many livestock like cattle and sheep, they consume large quantities of plant matter, and they rely on this gut bacteria to digest that high concentrated cellulose. And we've seen in a lot of cases of termites before too, that gut bacteria, they live in this low oxygen environment. And so the digestion inside of the environment produces a lot of methane byproducts. And manure from these livestock, when it decomposes, will produce a lot of carbon dioxide. even in a high oxygen condition. But the low oxygen conditions, like those manure lagoons that we've talked about before, if they're not aerated, they'll decompose and a lot more methane is formed. Deforestation here is next on the list. Each day, living trees, they remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in the process of photosynthesis, if you remember, and decomposing trees, they add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So the part of the carbon cycle that does not change, the net atmospheric carbon overall input, because the outputs are approximately equal. So as it dies and as it lives, it basically counteracts itself. However, when an entire forest is destroyed by humans, or it's destroyed and it decomposes and it's not replaced, as that can happen, when the destruction of all of that vegetation takes place, it causes a huge increase in overall atmospheric carbon dioxide. This is because the mass of carbon dioxide that makes up the trees is added to the atmosphere by the combustion or the decomposition of those trees. So the shifting agricultural description that we've talked about before, the clearing of forest and burning of vegetation to make room for new crops, that's a major source of not only particulate matter in the air, but also a number of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and N2O, nitrous oxide. All right, landfills. We've talked a lot about those before. They receive a great deal of credit, don't they? But household waste that slowly decomposes under layers of soil produces a lot of byproduct. And when the landfill is not aerated properly, it creates that low oxygen environment like a wetland, and it decomposes, causing the production of methane as a byproduct. Anytime we have a creation of some new industrial chemical, it's often an unintended effect. Hurting the atmosphere is really not intentional based on the company's, original plans. We looked at CFCs in great detail, and that whole family of chemicals that serves like it's inside of refrigerants and air conditioners, freezers and refrigerators. They were used in the past until scientists discovered that they were pretty much damaging the protected ozone layer. And the nations of the world basically joined together and signed that Montreal Protocol on a substance that depletes the ozone layer, which phased all of that stuff out. It phased out their production, and so it was over, I think, by like 1996. Unfortunately, many of the alternative refrigerants that are less harmful to the ozone, including groups of gases known as hydrochlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, they still have a very high greenhouse warming potential. And as a result, developed countries will phase them out eventually here too, but we've been given until 2030. All right. So ranking these human sources on greenhouse gases, it can be quite a challenge. So what are the relative concentrations of each of these things, and how does that affect everything? So the major human source of greenhouse gases in the United States is shown here. You have methane, nitrous oxide, and then of course carbon dioxide. These things contribute to the warming of Earth through the process of digestion in livestock, landfills, and the production of natural gas and even petroleum products. So the major contributor to nitrous oxide, you can see in this figure, is agriculture. Because, it receives nitrogen from synthetic fertilizers, even combustion and industrial production of fertilizers, and a lot of other products. So finally, we can look at the number of carbon dioxide in figure C here at the bottom, and we can see that approximately 94% of all the carbon dioxide that is emitted into the planet comes from industry, and usually the burning of fossil fuels plus industrial process. So just take a second here to look at the diagrams and just see the major sources of methane, nitrous oxide, and of course carbon dioxide. Just because it's a naturally occurring type of gas doesn't mean we're not producing it in an unnatural fashion. A lot of scientists are concerned now about more meat and how that's going to change our global warming system. Beef and climate change are in the news all the time. Basically, cows, they emit a high amount of methane in belching and from their farts, essentially. And it's a concern because as humans, as our population demands more meat and there are a lot more cattle, we increase that overall methane production from cows. And so animal-based foods, they are nutritious and they're important to our livelihoods and our diets, but they're also inefficient when it comes to creating useful food that can help our bodies, but also be good on our overall ecosystem. In order for this to be more efficient, we need to find other ways because forests are still being cut down, and people say they want to eat more plants, but they're still consuming a lot more meat. And if you haven't noticed in the grocery store, meat is becoming extremely expensive. The price on protein is really high. Eggs are even going up. And so it's just something to think about. Like, is it worth it? As we demand more beef products, particularly, what's that going to do to our greenhouse emission? I mean, I don't see farmers going around taking their cattle and lining them up to pay for an emissions test and pay taxes on all their cattle farts. But I got to pay it on my minivan.